There was a time when noon arrived quietly. No alarms, no buzzing pockets, no glowing screens demanding attention. Noon simply happened. When the sun climbed to its highest point, work paused. Shadows pulled in close. Church bells rang, not to command life, but to reflect it. Every town kept its own time. A noon in New Orleans was not the same noon in New York, not by minutes, by meaning. Time was local, personal, human, and for centuries that was enough. But then we learned how to move faster than the sun. Steel rails cut across the land, engines chased horizons once unreachable, and suddenly the sky could no longer keep up. Schedules clashed, clocks disagreed, the sun became unreliable. So a decision was made, not by governments, not by the people, but by the machines that demanded precision. In a single day, without violence, without protest, time was taken from the sky and handed to industry. The sun still rose, the shadows still moved, but they no longer decided anything, because on that day, time stopped belonging to nature and started belonging to us. Before clocks ruled the day, time wasn't something you checked. It was something you noticed. You didn't ask what hour it was. You looked at the sky. When shadows shortened, the day was at its center. When they stretched long again, evening had begun its quiet approach. Noon had no number, no label, no urgency. It arrived the same way seasons arrived, gradually, without announcement. In small towns, church bells rang not to enforce a schedule, but to mark a shared moment. Farmers stopped in the fields. Shops dimmed their lanterns. Meals were taken when bodies were hungry, not when clocks permitted. Every community lived inside its own rhythm, set by latitude, weather, and the slow patience of the earth. A town 30 miles east experienced noon before its neighbor, not because it was early, but because the sun said so, and no one argued with the sun. Clocks existed, of course, sundials in courtyards, mechanical clocks in steeples and homes. But they were references, not authorities. They followed the sky. They did not command it. Life bent around daylight. Work paused when darkness came. Rest wasn't scheduled. It was unavoidable. Time had imperfections. It drifted. It disagreed from place to place. But in that imperfection, people understood something we've since forgotten, that time wasn't universal. It belonged to where you stood. And that would soon be a problem. For most of human history, distance protected time. A message traveled only as fast as a horse. A person moved only as far as their legs allowed. Time, like everything else, arrived slowly. And because it arrived slowly, it stayed consistent. But speed changes rules. When railroads began stitching the country together, they didn't just move people, they collapsed space. Towns once separated by days were suddenly linked by hours. And the sun, dependable for centuries, could no longer keep up. A train could depart one town at noon and arrive in another before that town's noon had even arrived. Timetables didn't agree. Clocks contradicted one another. Conductors argued. Passengers missed connections. Time itself became unreliable. Railway schedules filled with asterisks and footnotes, each town listed with its own local minute. A journey wasn't measured in miles, but in confusion. Worse, mistakes became dangerous. A few minutes' difference was no longer an inconvenience. It was a threat. Trains traveling blindly on mismatched time shared the same tracks. Signals relied on clocks that couldn't agree on the present. Collisions followed. Steel met steel at full speed, and suddenly the cost of imprecise time was measured in bodies. For the first time, human progress had outrun the sky. The sun still rose and set, but it no longer governed movement. Speed demanded precision. Precision demanded agreement. And agreement could not be negotiated with something as ancient and indifferent as daylight. The problem wasn't that time had changed. It was that humans had. And once speed exposed the weakness of the old world, there was no returning to it. Something would have to give, and it wouldn't be the machines. The railroads did not see chaos. They saw inefficiency. Missed connections slowed profits. Conflicting clocks disrupted schedules, and every unanswered minute cost money. So the solution didn't come from philosophers or astronomers or the public. It came from the companies that needed time to behave. Railroad executives gathered, not to debate the meaning of time, but to control it. The proposal was simple. Divide the continent into zones. One shared time per region. No drifting minutes, no arguing suns. 4 great bands of time would stretch across the land, ignoring rivers, mountains, and old ways of living. The sun would no longer decide noon. Clocks would. This wasn't a law. There was no election, no public announcement that something ancient was about to be replaced. Railroads simply began printing new timetables. Stations adjusted their clocks. Conductors enforced the change. If your town wanted the train, it accepted the time. And most did, because the trains were bringing mail, goods, jobs, and connection to the wider world. To refuse standard time was to choose isolation, and no town could afford that. What made the change so powerful was how reasonable it felt. Nothing was taken by force. Nothing was destroyed. The clocks were just reset. The sun still rose, shadows still moved, but they no longer mattered. For the first time in history, time was not inherited from nature, it was engineered. And once engineered, it worked too well to ever be undone. On November 18th, 1883, America experienced something strange. Nothing collapsed, no alarms sounded, no crowds gathered in protest, and yet, time changed. On that morning, cities across the country began resetting their clocks. Some jumped forward, others slipped back. A few hesitated, then complied anyway. In certain towns, noon arrived twice. In others, it never arrived at all. Newspapers would later call it the Day of Two Noons. But at the time, most people barely noticed. Church bells rang at unfamiliar moments. Shop doors opened early, or late. Meals felt slightly off, like waking from a dream too soon. And then, life continued. That was the remarkable part. An idea that would permanently reshape human existence passed without confrontation, because nothing felt stolen. The sun still rose where it always had. Shadows still traced their arc across the ground. But somewhere between the minute hand jumping forward and the second hand resuming its march, authority shifted. Time no longer answered to the sky. It answered to agreement. Railroad stations became the new reference points. Public clocks followed suit. Private homes adjusted to stay in step. And slowly, a shared rhythm spread across the country. Not born from nature, but imposed for coordination. What had once been local became national. What had once been lived became measured. No one signed anything. No one was asked. Because by the time anyone noticed, the change already worked. Trains ran on schedule. Commerce flowed smoothly. Confusion faded. And in exchange for convenience, people surrendered something subtle, their ownership of the day. By sunset, time had been standardized. By morning, it felt normal. And that was the most permanent change of all. At first, standard time was optional. Railroads adopted it, cities followed it. Individuals adjusted without much thought. But systems rarely remain suggestions. Once clocks were synchronized, everything else began to align around them. Factories sounded whistles not at dawn, but at the same minute every morning. Schools opened and closed by the clock. Courtrooms, offices, and markets began measuring life in hours instead of daylight. Time stopped describing the world and started regulating it. Eventually, government stepped in, not to create time, but to enforce what already worked. Standard time was written into law. Time zones gained legal authority. Being on time was no longer polite, it was required. Missing a meeting had consequences. Arriving late could cost a wage, or a job, or a reputation. Clocks became witnesses. They decided who was punctual, who was disciplined, and who was out of step with the new order. For generations, humans had organized life around seasons, weather, and light. Now life was organized around schedules. Work was no longer something you finished when the sun faded. It ended when the clock allowed it. Sleep was delayed, meals were rushed, rest became negotiated, and all of it was justified by a single word: progress. Because synchronized time made productivity measurable, and measurable productivity made control efficient. By the time anyone questioned the trade, it was already complete. The sun still governed the natural world, but the human world answered to something else, a system of numbers that never slept, never drifted, and never cared how tired you were. Time had become law, and laws, once accepted, are rarely rolled back. Today, we rarely look at the sky for time. We check our phones, our watches, the glowing numbers on dashboards and walls. The sun can be hidden behind clouds or buildings or screens, and it doesn't matter. Time no longer needs to be seen to be obeyed. We wake when alarms decide. We eat when schedules allow. We rest when exhaustion forces the issue. Even our language reveals the change. We spend time. We save it. We waste it. We run out of it, as if it were something owned, not lived. The clock has moved from the wall into our minds. We feel guilt when we pause, anxiety when we fall behind, relief when we're early. None of this comes from the sun. It comes from synchronization, from a world built to move in unison, where being out of step feels like failure. And yet, the old time hasn't vanished. It still exists in moments we forget to measure, in sunsets that linger longer than expected, in conversations that drift without urgency, in days that blur together because they didn't matter to any schedule. That time still belongs to the earth, but reclaiming it now feels radical. Because once time was standardized, it didn't just organize trains, it reorganized us. The railroads didn't steal the sun, they made us stop listening to it. And ever since, we've been moving faster than the sky, wondering why we feel left behind.